Thank you very much, Michael. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Open University DiscourseNet collaboration London seminar. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce to you Dr. Niru Perera today. Niru is a research fellow at Curtin University, Perth, Australia, on the unceded Whadjuk Noongar land. However, today she's joining us from Canberra, Australia, on the unceded land of the Noongarwal and Ngumbi people. And I understand, Niru, that it is midnight for you now. So thank you very much for joining us at this late hour. And special thanks for accommodating to our time zone. Niru is a discourse analyst interested in health communication, language policy, migration, and religion. She has worked both in Australia and in Sri Lanka and published widely in academic journals and edited volumes. And she has also published a book titled Negotiating Linguistic and Religious Diversity in a Tamil Hindu Temple in Australia, which appeared in 2022 with Routledge. Today, Niru will present on her current research project on health communication titled Accentism in the Ambulance, the Misperception of Callers' Competence, Confidence, and Emotional State in Emergency Medical Calls. Thank you very much, Niru. Over to you.
Thank you, Jaspal, and thank you. Hello, everybody. And thank you very much to Jaspal for inviting me into DiscourseNet, and to Johanna, Stephanie, and Michelle for organising this seminar series. So I'll begin. So I'm presenting today on behalf of my colleague Marine Ryu, who is based at University Lumière Lyon 2, and unfortunately she can't be here today. But this talk stems from a long-time collaboration between the two of us. For the last 5 years, we've been analysing communication in emergency ambulance calls. And in particular, we're looking at language barriers in Australian emergency calls. And in the cases in Australia, the studies we've done, we look at callers who speak English as an additional language and have low or medium proficiency in English. But for the talk I'm giving today, our project focuses on French ambulance service call centres, where the callers have a non-standard accent, not necessarily a language proficiency issue. And with these non-standard accents, they can face difficulties in being heard by the call takers. The call takers are the staff who answer the calls at the ambulance call centre. And our project on discrimination stems from this long-time exposure to thousands of calls in English and French, and clearly hearing time and again that not all callers are treated equally. Right, so before I go into the details, I'll just acknowledge where I am. Jaspal referred to that I'm talking to you from Ngunnawal country. And Ngunnawal is the Aboriginal nation where the capital of colonised Australia, known as Canberra, sits. And the map on the right is just not so much related to the talk, but out of interest, it shows the hundreds of first languages in Australia that have been used by Indigenous people in the past, and because of colonial oppression, much less of these languages are used in the present. And I'd like to introduce Marine Ryu, that's her photo on the right. And Marine and I met through our roles as research fellows at an emergency medicine research unit at Curtin University in Australia. Marine was the first linguist to join a team of clinicians, biostatisticians and epidemiologists who worked with the West Australian Ambulance Service. And when Marine moved back to France, I took over her role. So here we are, we're two predominantly qualitative researchers working within a team who take a quantitative and positivist approach to research. And the basis of the talk today is the issue of health inequity. So in the field of health communication, it's largely acknowledged that calm people, that's culturally and linguistically marginalised groups, experience poorer health outcomes, and this is connected to racism. So such negative experiences can mean that calm people avoid or delay seeking medical assistance. And language and communication are key components of this health inequity, but the health system has historically not paid attention to its important role in health. So here are some of the many terms you might come across which concern communication and health inequity, and they're all interconnected. Today we're going to focus on the two on the right, and that's accentism and epistemic injustice. And our setting is one ambulance call centre in France, which will remain anonymous. And the French ambulance service is known as SAMU. The staff who answer the calls, we refer to them as call takers, but they're also known as emergency medical dispatchers. So I'm going to show you an article that came out from the BBC in 2018, and I'll just give you a second to read it. And because we can't have full audience participation, I might see if Jaspal or Michelle want to give me their impressions of what they see when they read this article. Here it is.
Do you just want me to just give you a?
What comes to your mind? I guess I don't need a deep analysis or anything, but just what comes to your mind when you read this article?
I mean, if so you mean the transcript on the site, right? I mean,
I guess
it kind of feels like the emergency respondent doesn't take the caller seriously. Kind of almost sort of like making this statement, "I'm going to die," irrelevant. By I mean, I find it very strange, to be honest. I don't know how to immediately react to it. It's very unprofessional, I think.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Jaspal. Michelle, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yes, there's some comments in the chat. So
Oh.
Sua said anger comes to mind. And Shonia said the operator could have asked what makes you think you will die. Yeah, so I also thought badly trained operator, right? Normally they have a script and are taught.
Yeah, good point. And so maybe it was my my own perspective, my own bias after listening to so many calls. But when I saw this picture of a non-white person, I immediately thought this has to do with racism. Now, there's no mention of that, and it's an assumption. What they do acknowledge in this article is the family of Naomi Musenga who died. They said, "We don't blame this individual operator. We acknowledge the systemic issues at play here, the lack of support for call takers, the high call volume, the high pressured environment that they work in." But at the same time, we know that the call taker didn't take Naomi's report seriously. She didn't take the stomach pain seriously. And there's no mention of Naomi's identity in the article, no mention of racism or accentism being a factor. And I imagine the BBC reporter would probably be reluctant to mention any link between racism and the operator's behaviour, even if it was just speculation. But I guess what I wanted to say is maybe that's the point. Like, we're often reluctant to name the possibility even of racism or accentism if there isn't any evidence. And so that's we'll remain with that idea and we'll move on. Okay, so I just wanted to outline some of the context in which this call took place. So this is a high stakes, time sensitive communication context in the emergency medical call centre. Both the caller and the call taker need to work together to achieve intersubjectivity. So for emergency ambulance calls, there are two factors that make this context particularly vulnerable to language barriers. So number one, parties are dealing with urgent life or death stakes and time is moving quickly. And that quick moving time is really critical to the patient's survival. And intersubjectivity relies entirely on the auditory channel. There's no visual platform. The caller is the one with all the information on what is happening at the scene of a medical emergency, and the call taker needs to elicit and understand this vital information in order to dispatch the appropriate help at the right time. We've been looking mainly at cardiac arrest emergencies, which are considered the most time critical because basically the heart stops working. And if we don't commence resuscitation or CPR within 10 minutes, and that's usually the person calling that has to start that CPR, then the chances of survival are very low. And I wanted to make the point that calm callers can often speak the dominant language, but it may be a different variety to the standard, and it may be spoken with a different accent. So just a bit more about this concept of accentism. Ambulance calls can be a setting for linguistic-based discrimination or accentism, where accented callers are judged to be less intelligent, credible, or rational. A lot of these studies are kind of psycholinguistic or psychological studies where they get people to listen to accents and then rate those accents on, you know, how much they believe what that person is saying. There's this notion that accentism can be unconscious or covert, and that makes its existence difficult to prove. I've included on this slide lots of other research on accentism, but basically the main points are that a normative accent is seen as no accent at all, and accentism is seen as a more acceptable form of discrimination. It's, it can be covert, and it's not as overt as a skin-coloured based prejudice. And the last point, it can be a proxy for language unrelated negative attitudes towards members of different groups. And the other concept is epistemic injustice in healthcare. And Fele sums it up really well. She calls it a misjudgment of patients' intelligence, credibility, and rationality based on the language that they speak and the manner in which they speak it, consequently impacting on the quality and equity of care provided. So, one of the challenges we face as communication analysts, especially when we work in this cross-disciplinary team of evidence-based scientists, is how to prove that someone is being treated differently based on their accent. So methods like conversation analysis and ethnomethodology require us as analysts to prove that a speaker is being assigned a category membership that is the source of differential treatment in the interaction. In our case, unless the call taker is being explicit, saying something like, I can't understand your accent and I don't like it, then how do we provide evidence from these call transcripts and recordings that accentism is at work? So we looked at some critical race scholars like Williamson and Rawls, who talk about this tacitness of racism and the white lens that requires evidence that it exists. Often people who are subjected to discrimination, it comes as a visceral feeling. You know, they feel it physically, but there's not necessarily some concrete proof or way to articulate it. And this is because what Zhang Waring and Tadik say is these kinds of prejudices are often more safely expressed under the radar, and there's ambiguity and defeasibility, which are very much connected to how systemic racism works. But Rawls also says with Tuck, the other point I wanted to make is that scholars like Williamson are pushing back on this idea of providing proof, the burden of proof. Williamson says, I do not attempt nor desire to use ethnomethodology to show or prove anti-Blackness and related dehumanizing logics exist. We, those who experience, resist, and survive and witness anti-Blackness, already know. And so, when we know, but there's still a need for the research that exposes how this racism lives in interaction, and we need to document how it works. And so we turn to recent scholarship on critical conversation analysis, which takes a motivated investigative approach and uses conversation analysis to illuminate how issues of inequality and injustice are reproduced, resisted, and or transformed in talking interaction. And for our analysis, we also draw on ratio-linguistic ideologies and interactional sociolinguistics to support our analysis of interactional discrimination. And so our research question is, how does accentism influence the emergency call interaction, potentially leading to delays in providing medical assistance? We've based our analysis on the audio recordings and transcripts of emergency calls received by one French ambulance service. And we're focusing on these cardiac arrest calls because of their high stakes and time-critical nature. The callers in the cohort I'm going to present today speak French as an additional language or a variety of non-standard French, so their accents mark them as other speakers. As a bit of background, we want to look at the language ecology of France. And we see that French is the only official language in the country, but of course it coexists with numerous other languages and many varieties of French. Funnily, the French census does not collect data on population ethnicity. However, a 2008 survey found that only 45% of respondents used French as the main language at home. 17% of respondents in the same study self-reported an experience of racial discrimination in the last 5 years. And Afati and Feltin-Pallas estimate that 50% of people in France would experience accentism. This includes not only migrants, but people who speak another variety other than standard Parisian French. For example, overseas territories such as Martinique or Réunion. So I'll give you a bit of background on the French emergency response system so you know how it works. In France, there are two types of first responders who work together in the case of medical emergencies. It works differently in Australia, and I believe it works differently in the UK as well. So in France, we've got two first responders, the emergency medical service and fire and rescue, the firefighters. So when there's a medical emergency, a citizen's first option is to call 15 for SAMU. And in that case, they first talk to an assistant emergency medical dispatcher or call taker who identifies and prioritizes or triages the emergency and can send help right away by dispatching a crew from the fire and rescue. The call taker can also transfer the call to an emergency physician who can provide more specialized medical assessment and instructions to the caller. And from there, either the call taker or the physician can dispatch a medical team in an ambulance. So some callers choose to call fire and rescue instead. And if it's medical, the fire brigade transfers the call to the ambulance. So as Michael referred to, many ambulance services around the world, including Australia, have adopted a scripted protocol that tightly controls the emergency call interaction with the aim of efficiently triaging and processing emergencies. So, Shonea, I believe you're online. It's what Shonea and Joe and Gary referred to in their talk in January, these scripts that the call takers have to follow. So while these scripts allow for consistency, they've also proven to have some shortcomings. However, in the French case, in the case of SAMU, they don't use these scripted protocols. So the call takers have more flexibility in what they can say and how they control the interaction. However, for all calls, there are two critical pieces of information that call takers need to elicit to determine if a cardiac arrest is occurring. And that is whether the patient is breathing and whether the patient is conscious. And if the answer to these questions is no, then the call taker is to presume it is a cardiac arrest and take immediate action. Okay, so we're still in the process of analysing the transcripts, but today I'll present two particular cases. The first case it relates to this term epistemic injustice. And what I'm going to do, I'll show you the transcript and I'll just give you a few seconds to read it and then I'll take you through it. So just to introduce it, this is a call by a couple, a woman and a man, who are calling for their newborn daughter, who is only 1 month old. Both parents are French as additional language users and they have high proficiency in French. The father's speech you'd call moderately accented, and the mother's accent is more pronounced relative to that northern Parisian accent. But there's no evidence of any difficulty with expression or comprehension, either from the parents or from the call taker. And so the first extract I'm going to show you is between the caller, who is the father, and the assistant EMD. And before this interaction, before we look at the first transcript, there's already been a long interaction where they're trying to ascertain the location of the caller because they're calling from a public location. And already the call taker has shown signs of frustration with the caller about specifying where they are. So here's the first extract. So sorry, I should have just said, yeah, so these calls did take place in French and we put the English translation underneath. CT is for call taker or EMD and CAL is for caller. Okay, so in this first extract, we see the first opportunity for the assistant EMDs to suspect a life-threatening emergency. And that's in line 77 when they say, "And so what happened?" followed by "tell me." So there's basically soliciting a reason for the call. And the caller launches into a multiple turn telling. And the first thing they're doing is repairing a previous misunderstanding from the call taker that the child had had a fall. But the caller says she didn't fall, she was on her back, and that's referring to the back of the mother. I'll give you a second. Okay, so in line 85, the caller is still continuing the telling. So we take her out, and from that they mean they take the child off the mother's back, and the child must be in a baby wrap or a baby carrier. And they noticed a problem in line 88, et plus rien, and nothing anymore. And with this description of the situation, something is wrong. The father most likely means that there is no sign of movement or consciousness and or breathing. Nothing's there from the baby. However, the EMD doesn't provide any uptake after this concerning turn. Instead, what we see in line 89 is the caller actually addressing a bystander by trying to find out where exactly they're located, as you see in line 91. Okay, we're going to move on to the next extract from the same call, which occurs about 22 seconds later. Okay, so we've had the first opportunity in the previous extract for the call taker to recognize something's wrong. And now there are more opportunities in this extract. So there's this prolonged and difficult address sequence. And then 22 seconds later, the call taker comes back to this reason for the call in line 115. And what's wrong with the little one? Followed by what is she doing now? And then the call taker says, is she unconscious? And line 120, the caller confirms, now at the moment she is not breathing anymore. And this is a critical piece of information that should trigger a cardiac arrest recognition immediately, not breathing. But the call taker does not seem to recognize any urgent action being needed. Instead, they go on to another question, is she purple? And asking the color of the face is a follow-up question on the topic of breathing, because if your face is purple, you're not breathing. So she's asking the color of the face, but it still remains by asking this follow-up question, they have not recognized yet that or processed that the baby is not breathing. And we'll go on to the next slide. Okay, so here, so the call taker is asking, what is the baby like in the face area? And the caller isn't referring to the skin color of his child. He's focusing on whether the child has normal coloration. And he's saying, yes, she's normal. So then the EMD checks for alertness in lines 127 and 128. So this suggests that the EMD is still operating under the assumption that the child is conscious and breathing. And so we see in line 129, again, the use of this word rien. She's not doing anything, nothing, which he has used before. And then there's more silence. So the caller reiterates the statement in line 131. And again, this doesn't seem to raise, well, something happens now because the call taker in line 133 is checking that. Is she not moving at all anymore? And the caller confirms, no, no, no. And again, rien, there's nothing in line 136. So hopefully by this point you get that the message is very clear that something is seriously wrong. And the call taker seems to recognize that now in this, we're still on extract 2. The call taker says, is she breathing normally? And the caller answers, no, no, no. So they're no in a firm voice. She's not breathing now. And so finally the call taker, we think, understands that the child is not breathing. And so their response is to transfer the call to the doctor, which is the standard procedure when it's a cardiac arrest. Okay, so that's 2 extracts. And the next extract, we're going to see the call interaction between the EMD and the physician. So the EMD has put the caller on hold, and now they have a private conversation with the physician. And we think at this point, from this transcript, that the call taker understands that the baby is not breathing. However, when we look at the next slide, again, this question of recognizing cardiac arrest is put into question. And I'll give you a moment to read it. Okay, so extract 3 is, as I said, the handover interaction between the assistant EMD and the physician. And this is really significant. This is kind of useful for our analysis because it's the backstage of the ambulance call centre. It's not public facing. So the caller cannot hear what is being said. In line 6, I want to focus on line 6 because the call taker is about to report what the father said about the baby's breathing. However, the linguistic design of their statement casts doubts on the father's credibility. This is first done with the use of the word a priori, which suggests like a tentative or temporary assessment in need of confirmation. And the assistant also uses this marker of reportative evidentiality, d'après le père, according to the father. And this is really interesting because the call taker is explicitly identifying the father as the source of information. And by doing so, they're withholding their own endorsement of the breathing assessment. Because, as a matter of fact, every piece of information about a patient comes from callers. So why does the call taker choose to highlight the fact that it's according to the father and thereby downgrade the reliability of the father? And given that we've seen that the father's breathing assessments were unequivocal, it's particularly noteworthy that the EMD engages in this active interactional work, not to endorse it. And just to finish off that interaction with the physician, the call taker reports some more information about the baby and then says to the physician, I'm sending the firefighters, means they've already dispatched someone to the scene. And that's the end of that call. There is another call that occurs between the physician and the caller, but in the interest of time, we won't show you that transcript today. I do want to go back to the previous slide for a moment. Because from this extract, we've noted the assistant's disbelief that the child is not breathing, but there's also a suggestion that the assistant was orienting all along to accent or race in his interaction with the father. So if we go back to line 6, right before saying a priori, the assistant delivers a proposition containing hesitations, a false start, and it is eventually cut short. And this kind of grammatical structure, what it projects is most likely a noun phrase. They are suggests that he's about to express some membership to a category. So often we would say they are nurses, they are doctors, but he cuts his statement short. So the exact nature of that category remains unsaid, and the EMD self-repairs immediately and instead concentrates on what the father thinks is happening. So it's possible that the EMD was about to express membership to a racial or cultural category. And what sustains this interpretation is the amount of avoidance and unease at the beginning of line 6, suggested by the hesitations, the cutoff, and then veering off in a different direction to focus on the father's assessment. So we're not sure if this is kind of speculation, we can say, but we're not sure if the call taker is hesitant to state the membership of the caller because they don't want to appear to be racist, or they're not sure of the appropriate label or category to apply. But as you can see from this case, we have a caller with an immediately noticeable foreign accent who is met with mistrust, disbelief, and considerable delays when it comes to taking into account the vital information he has provided unequivocally about his child not breathing and multiple times. And let's not forget, this is a 1-month-old baby, so it's quite baffling why the call taker does not act with more urgency. Okay, we're going to move on to the second case, which is about misperception of emotion and tone policing. Oops, sorry, there we go. Okay, so case 2 comes from a nurse in an aged care facility who is calling for a resident. And the nurse speaks with an overseas variety of French, which makes her vulnerable to racialization. I'll show you the first extract. Okay, so in line 55, the call taker solicits a categorical identification from the nurse. You're what? And error. So the call taker identifies the caller as a healthcare professional, but within the French healthcare system, aide-soignant or carer is the lowest possible option in terms of socioeconomic and symbolic status. So the candidate answer provided may result from the call taker orienting to the caller's accent and racializing her, as minority groups are overrepresented in this carer profession. And it's an incorrect assumption, which the caller repairs in line 57. She's a nurse. So from line 59, we hear that the call taker is changing directions, very well so. But also I want to point out, which isn't quite evident in the transcript, from line 59, the audio quality of the recording momentarily deteriorates and the voices are a bit distorted on the call taker's end. And this is because the caller is stepping away from the phone. Okay, I'll present the next part of the extract. Okay, so as the call taker from the previous slide tries to initiate a new sequence, it overlaps with the caller's explanation of why there's this distortion. I'm setting up the oxygen. So they've obviously got the phone on speaker and they've had to move towards the oxygen machine to set it up for the patient. They're treating the setting up of the oxygen as the priority for the patient. The call taker responds, in line, there's a sigh from the caller in line 62, and we put that sigh down to the physical exertion of giving the oxygen to the patient. But in line 63, the call taker responds with a turn-claiming vocative, madame, as well as a directive in line 64 to calm down. And again, using this madame to get the caller's attention. So we interpret this as tone policing, not care work. Evidence to support this interpretation is the curt tone with which it's delivered and the fact that it is preceded by competitive overlap and 2 occurrences of this turn-claiming device, madame. But most importantly, the caller has not shown any sign of not being calm. Rather, she is distracted by the task of setting up the oxygen, which is explained in line 60. It's possible that the EMD orients to the voice distortion as a display of emotion rather than a technical difficulty. However, I want to show you extract 3 a bit later in the call. Here it is. So in extract 2, the call taker delivers this same directive in line 102 to calm down. However, this time there is no voice distortion. The caller is not away from the phone, they're next to the phone. And there's no hearable signs of the caller not being calm. So this calm down is delivered in a gruff manner. And after this long silence in line 101, because the call taker has asked the caller to check the patient. And so how could there be an emotion display when there's nearly 7 seconds of silence? In this case, with the nurse, we focused on this overestimation of her emotional state as distressed or panicked. But from the previous slide where the call taker assumed her to be a carer, there's also this evidence of underestimating the caller's competence. So callers with an accent are often misperceived as more upset than their emotional displays suggest they really are. And this has two major consequences. A caller perceived as too upset can be considered uncooperative and unable to carry out potentially life-saving instruction. The second thing is that this can lead call takers to engage in rebukes and tone policing, which can lead to a climate of hostility. Tone policing has been described as a silencing tactic, specifically targeting gender and racial minority groups. And we refer to some work by Ashley in 2014, who focused on this stereotype of the angry Black woman, which presumes all Black women to be irate, irrational, hostile, and negative despite the circumstances. And for Black women or people that sound like Black women in the phone call, this can have a detrimental impact on their ability to perform as a healthcare professional. Okay, and just some final points before I finish, sorry. Right, okay, so one of the things that I've talked about today is how we've kind of, we're still in the focus of in the process of trying to find out a suitable methodology that enables the exploration of discrimination in interaction. So we've referred to critical CA, ratiolinguistics, and interactional sociolinguistics. And further down the line, we'd like to use linguistic ethnography as another way to try to piece together what we're seeing in the interactions. And the second point is we want to highlight that we're very much looking at a systemic issue. And what we're doing with the analysis of the transcripts is looking at the micro in order to progress this systemic change. As Ram Jatin says, it's the institutions we need to change, these institutionally mediated perceptions that materially disadvantage particular types of accented speakers. So institutions need to find new ways of listening. Okay, just to finish off, some acknowledgements. We cannot thank enough the call takers and directors of the anonymous SAMU ambulance service for their support and help with data access and collection. And we appreciate that their support for our study means that we uncover uncomfortable truths about discrimination in the service. And we don't intend in any way for this presentation to suggest that it's only this particular ambulance service that's at fault or uniquely accountable. Accentism is part of a larger systemic issue that operates much beyond this specific organisation. Thank you for listening.